have my Guy Fawkes mask on there. I need to get a personal one, and maybe I'll just speak as Guy Fawkes in the corner here. So yeah, maybe first to point out some of the numbers that most people in the audience might know, but cybercrime is a huge business, and the projected damages for 2021 are about 6 trillion. So if you just look at data breaches in the United States, so the average cost for these data breaches for a company is $8.6 million. And so there's a data breach almost every hour now. And the reason why it's going down at the end, which is going to be different once all the data is in, is that typically these data breaches take more than 200 days to actually be discovered, and then it will take another 80 days or so to actually mitigate against them. You probably heard about the fact that last year Zoom was compromised and 500,000 accounts were just distributed freely on the dark web. And there's a lot more. So I'll make a couple of those examples just for storytelling to make that obvious. So these are probably a lot of the data breaches that people have heard about. So Yahoo lost hundreds of millions of records of hundreds of millions of clients. Uber paid a stiff fine because they actually covered up their own data breach for almost 2 years, where the records from drivers and customers were compromised and were available for sale. And then the largest fine was paid by Equifax for $575 million. And people are still to this day experiencing the externality of that particular data breach. And most people should know that, but there are laws in every single state that require the immediate disclosure of these data breaches. And we'll show that it's not only the states and the AGs that are coming after these companies for not doing that, but there's also other regulators that have an impact on that. I'm going to show some of those. So then what I differentiate, but it's also part of data handling and data security, is active data abuse by firms. So Facebook paid $5 billion in an FTC settlement, specifically because they had already been, at the time when they kept doing these particular violations, under an FTC decree that they violated. By the way, was violated again earlier this year. Amazon paid $888 million. I don't know why this is such a funny number, but for GDPR violations in earlier this year. And then before that, the largest fine was paid by Google for $56 million. Same reason, GDPR violations. They didn't implement the necessary tools for people to actually have their data, quote unquote, be forgotten. I'll talk about that for a while, while that actually is kind of a nonsense requirement, a nonsense ask, if you will. Then also what I would include and have included is anything that's a BSA or so Bank Secrecy Act violation and or AML violations. And overall, globally, banks paid about $14.2 billion in fines, and the US makes up 80%. US banks make up 80% of that fine. And here's just a few of the agencies in the United States that are concerned in any shape or form with certain privacy rights. But yeah, there's a lot more agencies that I don't mention on here. One particular one is interesting, is BIPA, which is the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, which is now in very similar fashion being implemented by Texas, Washington, California, New York, Kansas. And so that particular law led to Facebook paying yet another fine, specifically to Illinois, for the violation of biometrics laws. They were using the biometric features of Illinois citizens to train their AI. And so they ended up paying or settling it for $550 million. And as you can imagine, there's only so many companies that can pay a $550 million fine. And so for a lot of companies, that would simply be the end of that particular company. These are all new laws around the world that are being worked on and or enacted right now to extend data privacy law. A lot of that is based on the fact that we're also collecting more data. So that goes back to biometric onboarding, comes back to things like the digital health pass, where we are now collecting more sensitive data. And so that obviously requires different form of handling and different laws so that make sure that they are not being mishandled. I can maybe speak to just a few. So there's a new federal act on the regulation of data protection and privacy in telecommunications and media coming. It's kind of a e-privacy directive, and which will come into force actually already in December, early December, which changes a lot of things, but maybe interestingly will restrict the use of cookies to what is strictly necessary. One other thing, and that's specifically interesting for people in California, where I am. So California fairly recently passed CCPA, and there has been a lot of pushback against CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act, which to some extent models GDPR, the European Data Privacy Regulation. But there's now another regulation coming out in California called the CPRA, and it doesn't explicitly attempt to alter CCPA, so it's kind of funny. It's like yet another law for almost the same purpose, but it addresses specifically data breaches, and specifically they are the most interesting thing that I kind of made a note of. It covers something that CCPA didn't cover, which is specifically consumer login and credentials, which was not part of CCPA protection. Maybe then we'll talk in big strokes real quick about how technologies evolved. So we came about this by like this pre-digital era where we stored things like on paper and put them in file folders and then stored them somewhere in our office. And that in a way is a pretty good security technology, because if some nefarious actor actually wanted to do something with that particular information, well, they have to find out where that information resides locally, then break into that house, break into that drawer and find that particular document, take it or make a copy, and then do something with nefarious from it. And so actually that makes surprisingly a really good metaphor what we need to be developing. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So then what happened though is we invented database solutions. And so most of commercial activity was then in some shape or form facilitated using digital entries. But that was actually, and most people will know that, in the early 60s, but then ultimately we started connecting these databases to network technologies, including the internet itself. And that's a big problem. That is a huge problem, because databases were not inherently designed to be secure and part of networks. And that's why we saw all of these externalities earlier, that there's a data breach basically every hour in the United States and probably around the world. So this is a simplified graphic of how we see at the moment the Web3 stack. Needless to say, it's always evolving. So the bottom layer is the internet or Web 1.0 layer. So your TCP IP protocol, HTTP, SMTP, voice over IP. And so also what that should make obvious that blockchains aren't protocols, or then there are not protocols in the narrow technical sense. They are the protocols in the business logic sense, because they're also making use of protocols. And so then the point of this graphic is mostly to show there's all these different middleware solutions and addressing solutions, etc., that people are working on, teams are working on around the world, but they're very nascent at the moment, right? So right now, all of these functions are centralized functions, and you probably saw that Facebook at the beginning of the month, we're in October right now, went down for a couple of hours because of a particular DNS issue, and Facebook, WhatsApp, and other services at the Instagram and so forth were completely down, because it's a centralized solution that if it, for whatever reason, is no longer reachable, will take down all these services immediately. And that's why Also, if you analyze other blockchains, and like Solana was DDoSed not so long ago, you realize, okay, if that's possible, that means a number of things, including the fact that they are not decentralized and at this point in time. And for me, that also means that they are not a blockchain as of yet. Then what we invest in, so a lot of these companies are part of our portfolio for full disclosure, like keyless and mint-based ether risk and so forth, all part of our portfolio. But these are necessary on and off-chain services in order to interact with blockchain-based solutions. And then the obvious one, and we'll talk a little bit more about this particular level. Right now, we have kind of these very cumbersome browsers and what people call wallets like MetaMask that store things like digital assets. But at the moment, what we don't store much, there's lots of attempts. We looked at dozens of those. There's not much storing of credentials in a very useful fashion that would be able to interact with real-world economic activity at scale. It's very nascent. And then ultimately, though, all of these solutions and middleware will be used by users through applications. So that's why it's very unfortunate that we still hear battle cries such as blockchain adoption, cryptocurrency adoption. That's a little bit like saying voice of IP adoption. People didn't adopt voice of IP. Developers adopted voice of IP, and then users at large adopted things like Skype and WhatsApp to make use of that. And that's why also, like from an investor's perspective, you might have heard of thesis like the Fed protocol thesis, where value accrues to the network layer. I mean, that's a little bit like saying the value of SMTP accrued to SMTP and not to the email client. So that has historically not be true, and I don't have any expectation that this will be true in the long run. As I said, it's kind of an intermittent layer that will eventually abstract it away if we want indeed to see adoption of that technology by the population at large. So then I'll just make one example why all of these things are very urgent and urgent to understand. So there's a number of states, 8 states in the United States, that are issuing in the very near future digital driver's licenses. So Arizona, Connecticut, Georgia, Iowa, Kentucky, Maryland, Oklahoma, and Utah. They're all about to grant their particular citizens the right to store their driver's license in a digital form using the Apple enclave specifically. And so the reason why this is important to understand is it also then comes with particular facilities and functions, i.e. you see this TSA symbol on here. So the exchange mechanism, so the way that information from this digital driver's license will be shared is obviously encrypted, but then also there's only a particular form of information that gets passed on, because a part of the huge problem that we created is that we created these very simple documents like driver's license and so forth, where there's a wholesale connection of PII to every single transaction. And so the usual example I make for that, and that comes back to our earlier discussion about account-based systems. So in account-based systems based on the legacy technology, so based on database solutions, what happens is every time that you swipe your credit card or use your debit card or use any other form of transfer mechanism that involves your demand deposit account, there is a number of entities that get a wholesale stack of all your personal identifiable data. They get your first name, your last name, your address, and so forth. And if you think about it, if you did this particular transaction in cash, which if you look at your last 1,000 transaction, you probably could have done all of those in cash. It was just more convenient to not do them in cash. But because you use the digital medium that is account-based, all of that information now for every single transaction was shared on average with 5 entities. And so these 5 entities now have copies in some databases. that you often don't even know about, that these copies exist. And so that's why from the past, people probably have heard about things like the Target hack or AT&T hack. So a lot of the data that was sitting there, people were utterly unaware basically that this data even existed. But then more importantly, this data was also shared, and then in Target's case, for example, was sold back to Facebook to then create more nuanced profiles. And we're going to talk about profiles in a little bit, but to come back to like what you need to realize is that if, when, and where, and this is imminent, we have these particular digitally issued government credentials, you have to be able, from a technology perspective and an application developer's perspective, be able to integrate with those and deal with this data in a particular way that you don't do that legacy wholesale exchange of data anymore. And this knowledge is largely absent from almost every solution we looked at, probably close to 1,000 solutions over the past like 5 years in the matter of our fund investments. And this knowledge and this thinking is entirely absent. And there's another issue that I briefly mentioned is the fact that there's a lot of data exchange standards that exist. We were talking about the travel data exchange standard, that your solution also then still has to be backward compatible with, because otherwise there's no way for these vendors that are using these today to integrate with that, because as an externality, you might be trying to enter a country that you're arriving at, and they send you right back because the metadata that was sent didn't include any necessary records that these entities on the other side needed, but you didn't even know that this existed to begin with, something we see on a regular basis. So then maybe just real quick, we have right now as users these kind of main mechanisms to access information that is launched on networks. So the most obvious ones are the Chromes, Edge, and Firefox of the world. And to some extent, some of these are now starting or have been integrating some privacy and data protection solutions, so where there's like end-to-end encryption and so forth, but largely that's then again basically evaded by having a lot of things like cookies and otherwise data that are being inserted by websites that are still interested in just keeping records of who is visiting them for what purpose and want to follow them around and whatnot. So the future, if we get this right, will be purely Web3 browsers. And so right now, this is rather cumbersome. You have to install something like a MetaMask and then connect to a site that is running using a decentralized software solution that most people will still call blockchain. And that will allow you to actually use these particular applications. The difference being is at that point in time, I can store all of my PII in this particular browser, and I only pass on, if any information, I only pass on the information that I need to run this dApp, this decentralized application, in a very nuanced way. And ideally, the dApp will also just ask for very discretionary information that they actually need in order to provide you with a service or solution. So I think this is probably, that's my second to last slide. So this is the big picture, in my opinion, that is important to understand. So if you're looking at current network topology, which let's call it the internet. So the internet looks at human beings not very different than it would look at a weather station. So it will observe the data that's being created by the weather station or by that human, then it will make some copies, distribute these copies, then it will refactor it, and then make this data available to typically either the platform provider, i.e. Google, Facebook, or the clients of these platform providers. And then these platforms will either offer something like a social engineering as a service solution that then influences your behavior. So the larger point there being is, so the current network topology doesn't actually consider your humanness. So it treats you like an oracle function from a technical perspective, right? And so for us and for this technology to serve us, we need to reverse this particular paradigm. We're reassigning agency to the endpoints of the individuals here. So the reason why I use these particular labels, and there's a lot more layers, I'm just using the high level ones I'm working on a very detailed taxonomy that people will be able to download directly from GitHub. But so the individual, so you, the human, or could be an entity, but typically we're talking about humans, might have a bunch of personas. So personas is something that I want to represent online. So you have a persona that is, let's call it your LinkedIn profile, and profile again is kind of a conflation of terms here. So whatever data that you control on the platform of LinkedIn is what your persona is, right? And whatever data is under your control on Facebook, that's your persona. And then yeah, on top of that, and this is now data that you don't control, additional data, there's profile data, and profile data is called such because it's used for profiling. So if I'm LinkedIn, if I'm Google, if I'm Facebook, I attach other data to the data that I control, to whatever my behavior and the connections that I have, and I don't have access to that. I can't remove that. I can't ask them to change that. That's just something that they do on their end. And then overall, they might actually then enhance that with a lot of other data sources to make this profile even more useful for the actual client. So yeah, I have been writing about these concepts since 2008. The title of that book is it's still work in progress. It's no longer that grandiose. I'm no longer claiming that the world could be saved. So right now, I'm calling the working draft the reversal of the attention economy. And there's a couple of articles that speak specifically to some of the things that I've been alluding to. One was published in Forbes some time ago on the concept of digital vending machines and the question of identity specifically. And then there's some longer, somewhat more nerdy ones speaking to topology on HackerNoon that should be fairly easy to find if you just Google my name.